Now that Sony finally has some competition, it isn't slowing down on camera development. The Alpha A7R IV, its latest full-frame mirrorless camera, has a 61 megapixel sensor that's a huge 31% jump over its predecessor. That makes it the highest resolution full-frame mirrorless camera you can buy by a long way. It's not just about the megapixels though. The A7R IV lets you shoot at 10 frames per second with continuous autofocus and auto exposure enabled, which is incredible for a camera with that kind of resolution. It also delivers 14 stops of dynamic range and lets you shoot 4K video at 30 frames per second and 1080p at up to 120 frames per second. Finally, it has all of Sony's latest AI smarts, including the canny eye, face, and animal detect autofocus, first introduced on the A6400. So spec-wise, it's a monster. Now I'm going to take it out into the 7th arrondissement of Paris and see if it delivers in the real world. At first glance, the A7R looks similar to the last model, but there are some important differences. Sony addressed a common A7R III complaint by making the grip bigger. There's still not much room between the lens and handle compared to Panasonic's big S1R, but you're less likely to drop it. Even with those changes, it's only 10 grams heavier than the last model at 665 grams. In comparison, the S1R weighs over 2 pounds. The A7R IV has an updated 5-axis in-body stabilization system. With up to 5.5 stops of shake control, you can shoot handheld down to a 15th of a second. Competitors Nikon and Canon have brought out similarly lightweight mirrorless cameras, but Canon's ESR still lacks in-body stabilization. The control layout hasn't changed much, but Sony has improved a few things. The buttons are bigger, the power switch firmer, and the mode dial and joystick grippier. Overall, I found the A7R IV easy to handle, though folks with large hands might find it a bit cramped. The 5.76 million dot OLED electronic viewfinder is a big improvement over the last model. It's clear and has a fast 120 frame per second refresh rate with minimal lag, so DSLR users won't miss their optical viewfinders. The rear display is touch enabled, but the only thing you can really do with it is select focus. Thankfully, that function is more responsive than it was on the A7R III. It's also not a camera for vloggers as the display doesn't flip around. Speaking of that, Sony's menu system is still not friendly, like at all. Your best bet is to set up the A7R IV's controls as you like, then stay the heck out of the menus. As for storage, you get 2 high-speed SD UHS-2 card slots, which I think is ideal for most photographers. It has the same big battery as the last model and can deliver a stellar 670 shots and 170 minutes of continuous video recording on a charge. I found it easily met those specs in real life. While it's definitely not aimed at sports shooters, the A7R IV can shoot bursts up to 10 frames per second. You'll want to have a fast UHS-2 card though, and when I shot uncompressed RAW files up to 120 megabytes large, speeds dropped to around 7 frames per second. Shooting compressed RAW and JPEG files, the A7R IV could sustain 10 frames per second for a surprisingly long time, though it could take up to 15 seconds for the buffer to clear. With a flick of a menu setting, you could transform the A7R IV into a 26 megapixel APS-C camera with a 1.5 times crop factor. In that mode, I could capture 10 frame per second bursts for much longer, making it more useful as an action camera. The crop mode also brings you closer to the action, turning a 200mm lens into a 300mm lens. To top it off, the resolution is an added bonus for things like wildlife photography, as you can crop in a lot while retaining detail. None of that speed is of use without a good autofocus system, and that's where Sony is so far ahead of rivals. The A7R IV now has 567 phase detect AF points compared to 425 on the A7R III, and Sony has vastly improved the speed and accuracy of its AI-powered eye and face detection. It rarely let me down. While shooting horse jumping in continuous AF with a 70 to 200mm zoom, it locked onto the rider's face and eyes or tracked their body on wider shots. I had to time my shooting bursts well, knowing that the buffer would fill quickly and take a few seconds to reset. Still, considering the A7R IV's resolution, its ability to focus on fast-moving subjects is astounding. You shouldn't buy the A7R IV if your primary concern is video, but for casual shooting, it does well. To maximize bokeh and low-light capability, you can shoot at full frame with some line skipping. If you're okay with a crop, it'll downsample the entire APS-C area of the sensor to a crispy 4K. You can capture in that mode at up to 30 frames per second or shoot full HD at 120 frames per second. When shooting in S-Log3 mode, Sony claims you can get 14 stops of dynamic range, beating out cameras like Blackmagic's Pocket 6K. The main drawback here is the low bitrate and lower color depth, especially compared to the Pocket 6K. All of the autofocus features I liked in photo mode, like eye, face, and animal tracking, also apply to video. Sony has gradually improved its face detect video autofocus, so it's better than any rivals, except for Canon. When you're using face tracking though, it beats everyone. Finally, let's talk about the core strength of this camera, image quality. Of course, detail is incredible, and the way the sensor handles fine highlights is beyond anything I've ever seen. I was pleased with the natural color rendition of JPEGs right out of the camera, especially the lifelike skin tones. Dynamic range, meanwhile, gives you tons of shadow and highlight detail. If you under or overexpose a shot in RAW mode, you'll be able to recover details with well-controlled noise levels. The A7R does surprisingly well in low light considering the high resolution. At speeds of up to ISO 6400, you can use shots straight out of the camera. You'll see a fair amount of noise beyond that, but thanks to the high resolution, you can shrink it down when you deliver your final shots in web or print. I expected the A7R IV to be a class-leading high-resolution camera, and that's exactly what it is. Image quality is second to none when you need maximum detail. What really surprised me was how versatile it is. The A7R IV is no sports camera, but it has surprisingly quick burst speeds for such a high-resolution camera, and the autofocus will never let you down. It also works just fine for the occasional 4K video shoot. At $3,500, the A7R IV is vying against Nikon's $3,000 Z7 and the $3,700 Panasonic S1R. It beats those cameras in most areas, particularly resolution and autofocus, though the Z7 is a better choice for video. Sony itself is also overdue to release an A7S III video-centric model. All told, the A7R IV is in a class by itself when it comes to high-resolution, full-frame mirrorless cameras. If that's what you're looking for, and if you can afford it, I wouldn't hesitate for a second.